in the morning, it was time for him to step up. In other words, you got leaders lead. And during this period, he needs to lead as CEO of Tesla. And I think that's been part of the frustration. But I thought last night was a huge step forward in terms of this quickly put together all hands meeting, because it's showing employees, shareholders, what's the vision, medium and long term. That continues to really be the golden goose. And I think it was an important first step into ultimately more of a balancing act for Musk.
I don't know, Dan. And then he got right back on a plane and went back to D.C. You know, I don't know why him talking in front of his employees is such an important step. And I mean, is it going to keep people from not buying Teslas?
Yeah, I mean, like, Julie, my view is it's a first step. In other words, the whole goal here is, I'm not saying, and the many shareholders, for him to end Doge. It's about a balancing act.
So what else now? So what if that's the first step? What are the other steps? What now needs to happen?
Is that he needs to be more engaged at Tesla. He ultimately even when it comes to Doge, whether it's, very similar to, how Linda stepped in terms of at X, it's making sure that he is not front and center 5 times an hour when it comes to Doge. I think that, you talk about the political firestorm and everything else, the lightning rod. I think part of navigating that, it's that balancing act. He's going to get criticism, okay? And we understand that. That doesn't necessarily change the brand itself. If he starts to take a step back, that's where I think there's brand damage. It's a scar. It's a bad bruise, but it's not a permanent black eye.
Dan Ives, Corey Johnson here.
Hey, Corey.
Last quarter, 33% of free cash flow was from government subsidies, zero emission credits for most of it. 4 quarters ago, it was 100% of free cash flow. Do you start to look forward to a federal government that's cutting unnecessary spending, that has given hundreds of millions of dollars to Tesla, not doing that anymore? Does that change your models in the future?
Look, I mean, they've become much less reliant, right, when it comes to the credits. But look, I mean, you obviously raise a great point, which has been there, is that, and it's our view that Tesla, 90% of the value going forward is autonomous and robotics, which has nothing to do with EV tax credits. And I think, Musk talked about that in the all hands meeting. That's the future. And my view with Tesla continues to be, 6 times? We've seen the stock sell off 50% peak to trough. I mean, the point is we've been through many, very tough white knuckle times before. This is obviously one that's even broader in terms of the political landscape. Doesn't change my view. This and NVIDIA, the 2 best disruptive technology plays next decade.
Dan, let me ask you a different question, which some of your colleagues on the street, it's interesting. They'll say that all this talk of the branding and the politics and the chainsaw and the Mar-a-Lago, that is not really the issue. I've heard some of your colleagues say the issue is much more fundamental. It is a Model Y switchover. It's a Model Y changeover. That is what's meaningfully impacting deliveries. There's too much, they say, being placed on the whole branding debate. What is your take on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's some truth to both. Look, in terms of the actual numbers, in terms of the sales numbers, yeah, I mean, the brand issues have actually been, call it 10 to 15% of the actual decline, because a lot of that is changeover, refresh, and everything else. But Josh, I think in terms of the stock, 70% of the sell-off is brand issue, brand worries in terms of, some of the sort of crisis that we're seeing. And the reason is, it's investors kind of looking forward. In other words, Musk is Tesla, Tesla is Musk. He is the brand. And what he's created is a company that's obviously, globally, in my opinion, one of the best brands in the world. It's making sure that the brand damage doesn't spiral into something much more negative. And I think that's how I'd almost characterize those 2 issues.
I have to wonder if it's already there, Dan. And I also, I've been trying to think of other brand situations like this, right? You think about the Budweiser situation, you think about Target, you think about some of the other recent examples, and it has taken a long time in those cases, and they haven't. In some cases, they haven't even fully recovered, right? So, how long? Especially since he doesn't actually seem to be trying to do anything to repair this damage in terms of the brand and the image. I mean, how long could we see the situation play out?
Well, Joe, there's different ways to view it. I mean, some could argue, and we got to see how it plays out, like do more Republican or Trump supporters ultimately then start to buy Teslas, right? In other words, ones that weren't buying it, now they're Musk supporters, and that actually becomes a positive. Then it comes down to, when you look at the brand, I mean, I think Tesla's brand it's almost hard to compare, because you're going to have 10 million Teslas essentially on the road going into next year. And when it comes to autonomous, the question is, like, when you start to actually have cyber cabs, and we have what I believe 1 of every 5 cars autonomous, do people not take that because it's Musk? Because maybe something that happened a few years ago? I'm fast forwarding to the next, 1, 2, 3 years. So I'm just saying, I get the brand issues. We've talked about it, constantly over the last week. But the reason last night was important, because you read the room. It's the start of what I view as a balancing act, and I think that's very important.
Well, we'll see if he starts to take those next steps then, Dan. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Joining me now is Dan Ives of Wedbush. He's the global head of tech research. Well, Dan, I think I summarized it pretty good, but you think another $1 trillion in market cap from here?
I mean, Kelly, I think the golden goose is autonomous. I think that's worth $1 trillion in terms of valuation. The federal roadmap will now start to get paved. And that's ultimately, from a valuation perspective, I think autonomous and robotics is more than the company itself. So I get some of the brand issues and maybe some of the headwinds in Doge and, in terms of everything Musk is doing in the Beltway. But this continues to be the bet for the ages in terms of Musk betting on Trump, and that's going to hugely benefit Tesla. And that's why we think this golden buying opportunity in terms of this sell-off.
So I'm sure that investors in the stock would agree with you. The ones who have been in this, they're passionate, they're committed. Of course, they think, autonomous is the play here. But I still see a lot of frustration on social media about the performance lately. And even a couple of hours ago, Musk was tweeting about how the Boring Company is building a tunnel in Dubai or something. I mean, he has a lot going on. Would they prefer that his focus is more on Tesla?
Yeah, look, I think a few years ago, that would have been the preference. But I think the reality is, even some of the stuff Seaman talked about, everything we're talking about in terms of AI, having that front row seat at the table in that Trump administration, that's bullish in terms of AI innovation. I think more and more projects, especially that come through and that he's going to drive, I think is going to be very important in the China tariff discussions. And they have a massive innovation line coming out in terms of Optimus, in terms of autonomous, everything we see with Austin in terms of June. So look, haters are going to hate as they always do in Tesla. But I just think this sell-off here, I think it's just a massive buying opportunity given we see a $2 trillion market cap on the horizon.
Tell me about the China business. How much under threat is it, and what do you think might happen there on the tariff front?
Yeah, look, I think they're actually going to be least exposed when it comes to China, just because I think there will be exclusions when it comes to tariffs for Apple, for Tesla, some of the chips from NVIDIA. And look, 40% plus of demand as well as manufacturing comes out of China. But that's also why, Musk is 10% politician, 90% CEO. He plays well in the sandbox in Beijing. They want that trophy case of Musk and Tesla in China. And he's one of the rare people, along with Cook, that's able to be successful in China as well as the U.S. And I think a lot of sort of the worries there are well overdone. I think growth will return in terms of the China market.
All right. Do you think that is also what makes Musk's presence in Washington more help than hindrance? And how should competitors think about that?
Yeah, look, he's one of the rare ones that basically has that blessing from Beijing. And that's something from a Trump perspective as we get into these tariffs, as you'll see, obviously coming up today and just over the coming months. He's going to be a huge asset for Trump when it comes to China. He understands Beijing, has strong relationships in the government there, and also he understands AI. It goes back to NVIDIA, chips, everything we're seeing with Apple. That's why the street, I think, is kind of saying in this game of high-stakes poker, not as worried. That's what you're seeing in the stocks. But I do believe Musk, despite all the sort of worries, him having that front row seat in the White House is bullish for Tesla. And I think $1 trillion is the autonomous value. That's why I just view this as noise, despite some of the pain in terms of the sell-off.